All right, hello, Theater 319. Here's the lecture on Unit 3, which will take place in three parts. Part 1 is going to talk about general concepts of abstraction and anti-realism and talk about some designers named Oppie and Craig who dove into this stuff a little bit. Part 2 is going to talk about expressionism, which is an important ism in our parade of isms that we'll deal with this semester. And Part 3 we'll talk about Treadwell in particular. Sophie Treadwell, she's your playwright for the next play, Machinal, and feminism, specifically first wave feminism. So let's dive into Part 1. One of the ways in which I kind of think about conceptually moving us from the realism of Hedda Gabler to some of the anti-realistic stuff that takes place in Machinal is asking these questions in terms of visual art, right? So here's a question. How might or how should art portray real life? And I'm just going to present to you using visual art some answers to those questions, right? Here's one. Realism or naturalism says, and I would argue that Ibsen and Hedda Gabler say, art should portray real life objectively, literally. This is how the world actually is. This is a painting called The Gleaners by Millet, right? And the artist is effectively saying to the audience member, let's the two of us sit together and look at the world seeing the same thing. There are a handful of sort of deliberately abstract techniques in here, but really not much. I mean, the background's slightly blurry, which makes it feel maybe a little bit romanticized on purpose or nostalgified, right? But basically, there's not much difference here between this and a photograph of exactly the same thing, right? So the idea here is there's no abstraction going on in the creation of what you're both looking at. Of course, there is abstraction in going on inside your brain about how you might be interpreting it differently, right? But the idea here is that Millet with this painting, The Gleaners, or Ibsen with Hedda is going to say, here we are looking at a reproduction of the world, right? Another way I like to think about this is this is like a zoo exhibit with a one-way mirror, and we're looking in at the animals in their environment, right? So we sit there, and there's a fourth wall separating us and the world of Hedda Gabler, and we watch, and we all see the same thing, and the thing we see looks just like our everyday lives, is the idea, okay? So let's take a step away from that. Here is Claude Monet, his painting Houses of Parliament, London, sun breaking through fog. Clearly, there's still some realism here, right? I mean, look at the title. We're in a specific place. A specific thing is happening that you can connect, and we've got a specific object, which is the Houses of Parliament, right? So there's still some realism here. We're reproducing everyday life, but obviously this is Monet, and we have deliberate abstractions, right? He is sitting there saying, why don't we portray life subjectively? Why don't we portray the world based on how the artist sees it? Because you know what, Millet, or you know what, Ibsen, we can all take a photograph, but not everybody sees the world this way, the way that I do, right? So the artist says to the audience member, put on my glasses and see the world the way I see it. In the specific case of Impressionism, that way is usually more beautiful than it actually is, right? You can see the beauty and the mystery of this moment is enhanced in the way it's painted. Quick note, Impressionism is really visual art only. There aren't exactly impressionistic plays. But I think from a visual art standpoint, this takes us one step away from straightforward realism. So let's take another step away from straightforward realism with Munch's The Scream. How does Edvard Munch answer this question? How should art portray real life? Subjectively, based on how the world feels to me, the artist, right? When Munch painted this painting, I guarantee you he was not at the end of a pier with an easel at sunset with a model wearing a bizarro alien head mask while two other people walked menacingly towards the model. Like that didn't happen. This painting and this feeling exists inside of the artist's head, right? The artist says to the audience member, look inside my head, my heart, my soul, and see how the world impacts me, right? So what this effectively is Munch saying, I can't find a way to tell you what it feels like to be me using words, so instead I'm going to paint. And you all have felt this way at one or another moments or many moments in your life, says Munch. And so you might relate. You might see kind of what's going on here with Munch. So We've got all three. How the world is, and again, I want to point out, is a tricky term because it proposes an objectivity that doesn't go inside our brains where nothing in the brain is objective, right? How the world is for realism, how I see the world for expression or for impressionism, and then how the world feels to me, this expressionistic idea. So here's what I want you to think about for the discussion document. Pick 2 moments of realism from Hedda Gabler and answer 1, what makes these moments realistic, and 2, how might you make these moments more anti-realistic in production or playwriting, and why? Because one of the recurring threads from this whole lecture and this whole section is Hedda Gabler tells the story of a woman trapped in social historical circumstances. So does Mackinac. They tell those stories differently. The substance of those stories is different, but also the style of those stories is different. And the relationship between the style, the substance or the agenda and the style is an important and interesting thing. So let's talk about 2 artists. Oh, sorry, one other question from Mackinac. After you've read the play, choose 1 realistic moment, 1 anti-realistic moment from Mackinac. How does each of these moments use style to communicate the play's agenda, right? The play talks about the challenges that our main character experiences all the way through. But sometimes those challenges are portrayed realistically and sometimes they're portrayed anti-realistically, right? How is the realistic or anti-realistic style used to communicate the play's agenda? All right, now let's talk about these guys. Edward Gordon Craig on the left and Adolphe Appia on the right. These were 2 designers who towards the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century said, basically, realism, from a design standpoint, realism, you are boring and insufficient. And Appia was German, so there he is saying it in German, right? Really important note, these 2 guys never met, collaborated, or worked together. Craig is British. Appia, like I said, is German. They were not pals. They were not collaborators. They were aware of each other's existence, but that's about it. However, they came up with some very interesting parallel ideas in their own theater design practices. So let's have a look here, all right? In Germany, Appia is going to theater and going to shows and seeing things like Richard Wagner, remember folks, Wagner, not Wagner, Wagner and German operas, right? And if you don't know Wagner very well, just Google him and get an idea of some of the stories, sounds his opera makes, right? But generally speaking, he's got big epic ideas for what opera should be about. German mythology, kings, mystical beings, haunted forest, like he has a play about the Holy Grail. Or an opera rather, right? So he's got big, epic stuff. And he's doing his epic stuff at this theater right here. This is called the Bayreuth Festspielhaus, right? So if you're not familiar with what's opera doc, check out your Looney Tunes history. But right, this is where all this stuff is happening at the Bayreuth Festspielhaus. And I'll go back a second. Take a look at that backdrop. That is mainly a flat painted backdrop in front of or behind a bare stage, right? And it's also generic. That backdrop doesn't change a bunch for the different scenes in his operas, right? So there's Elmer and Bugs, right? And basically our guy Appia comes and looks at this and says, no, Nein, this won't work. This won't do, right? What he basically says is you can't have this epic opera on this ridiculous stage. Here's another one. Here's the traditional setting for a sacred forest scene in Wagner's Parsifal. This is one of those mysterious forests where dark and magical things happen, right? This just kind of looks like a wood, right? A woods. All of these things are flats, by the way, right? So like, yay, it looks kind of realistic, but nah, it doesn't really do much for me. Like this forest doesn't make me feel dark enchantment, right? It's like, all right, there's a tree. Yeah, got it. Meanwhile, in England, Edward Gordon Craig is doing the same thing and going to shows and saying, I don't know if what we're doing here design-wise works, right? Here's the design for Macbeth from England from 1892. And I mean, this looks pretty badass, right? Like this has its own particular kind of appeal. However, as you probably as theater people have noticed at various points, this looks really epic when you draw it. But when you build it on the stage, especially with 1892 lighting and materials and technology, it doesn't look good, right? Taking a mysterious moment like this from Macbeth, we got our witches and all this magic and darkness and weirdness going on, taking this mysterious moment and executing it on stage in realism, it's It's not so good, right? Same here. Here's a great battle scene from King Lear. It's a little pixelated because the picture is old and small and I blew it up, right? But like, again, this looks really epic. But when you actually put it on stage, that backdrop's a flat painted backdrop, so immediately you see that, right? And it just doesn't look as good as it could, right? We tend to look at stuff like this from the 21st century and think film, and I completely agree. You could do great work with this exact template. You can make a really good movie set, right? Same with this one too. These would be great movie sets, but when you're building them with realism on stage, flat painted backdrop looks stupid and fake. And in fact, what this does, says Craig, is takes us out of the moment instead of drawing us into the moment. So these two guys have some things to say. Again, separate continents, separate time, or separate work. They didn't collaborate. Appia says, Wagner, you want the soaring opera about epic stuff and you're doing it with stupid, like little flat painted backdrop trees. Meh, right? He says instead, ideality can only be represented by simplicity and suggestion. So stop for a minute on that first word, ideality, right? What he means is these legendary, epic things that we're talking about, these idealized things, things involving magic and the gods and the Holy Grail, right? Those are idealized things, things that are beyond real life. What he's saying is you can only do that magical, epic stuff by simplicity and suggestion. You can't do it with realism. Now, again, 21st century film would totally disagree with that. See any work of science fiction, Marvel Comics, Harry Potter, etc., right? Those magical worlds can totally be represented today by absolute full-on realism, but not on the stage is the argument, right? Actors, he also notes, can't move on these two-dimensional sets. You give somebody a flat painted backdrop in a bare space, there's nothing to do, right? You can stand here, you can stand over there, and there's no reason. Okay, here's Craig in England. Irving, there's no aesthetic harmony here. You're telling stories about witches and kings and the fate of nations on this really fake-looking set, right? If you're going to tell stories that are epic, then your design has to be epic. Design must also, here, check this one out. The design must reveal the spiritual universe of the imagination. Go try that one the next time you're sketching out a design idea, right? Oh yeah, my design for this show will reveal the spiritual universe of the imagination. These guys were big thinkers with crazy, abstract, lovely, wonderful, interesting ideas. But they did say crazy stuff like that. And I mean crazy in a good way. Beauty and truth, which is of course what we're searching for in Shakespeare, right? Beauty and truth are found in symbols, not reality. So think about that one kind of as we move forward. So remember this one, right? He says, this Parsifal forest scene is no good. It won't do. It's too realistic. How about this one? Yeah, now there is a dark and mysterious forest. I don't see a single leaf. I don't see any brush on the ground. I don't see the texture of realistic bark on the trees. There aren't any stupid flowers. I don't even know what's going on back there in the lightness, right? I don't see the forest canopy literally, but I feel it. Okay, so this is the kind of abstraction we start getting into, right? So here's Macbeth, meh, rubbish, right? Oh, how about this? Here's Craig's design for Macbeth in 1928. Unit set, you can do the whole play right here. All you need is a bridge, some space under it, and we can do absolutely everything right there. No, there isn't a bridge that is demanded in the set for Macbeth, right? But there are lots of bridge-oriented metaphors in Macbeth, and this gives your actors something to do, right? So these two guys say, here's some things you should do instead. Integrate all the elements into a unified visual whole. I know. That's like Design 101, but they were some of the first guys to actually say that out loud, first people to actually say that out loud, right? If the show's mythic, let the design be mythic. You should get rid of all these minor elements of realism. Hey, Ibsen, I know you spent a lot of time saying like that drawer should have an actual brush in it and the books on the shelf should be real. If we're doing epic stuff, if we're doing stuff that is trying to go above and beyond the mundane details of everyday life, then we got to get rid of the props and the details, right? Instead, we have to create spare, minimalist, but physically impactful design. And I'll show you some examples of that here in a minute, right? Enormous pillars, drapes, levels, platforms. Those moments you've had in your theater going life, which are rare, where you walk in and you look at the set, or the curtain comes up, back when they had curtains, right? Or used curtains, and the curtain comes up and you're like, whoa, this set punches me in the mouth a little bit. This set causes me to lean back and go, ugh, right? Big stuff. Emphasis on depth and dimension and rhythmic spaces for actors, levels, dimensions, distance, places for your actors to move. And again, I'll nail all this down when it comes to some images here in a minute. We were also, and this is an era, right, early 20th century, where lighting is becoming a lot more effective, a lot more able to do interesting things, so we can create mood and depth with our lighting. In summary, and this is a big important one to think about for you and your career as an artist, for you to think about in terms of how any play tries to tell its story. This is the idea of emotional expression being more important than objective reproduction of reality. That's a big, and they were not the first people to think of that, right? But all these things above from a design standpoint really sum up a lot of those ideas. So here's one. There's another forest for you, daunting canopy for you. Here's a rhythmic space. This is Appiah's early rhythmic space demonstrations. Think from a performer standpoint how many cool locations and opportunities that gives you to play. I can do all of any Shakespeare play on that set right there. I don't know if it's necessarily a good idea, but I can do it, right? Thematically, you probably want to have a little bit more connection between your design and your show, but this gives you multiple locations, causes you to use your imagination, has symbolic potential, and gives your actors places to run around. There's a little lighting drama for you. Those are backlit pillars, right? So that has a big impact visually. Here's an actual photograph of Appiah's design for Orpheus. Now you recall Orpheus is a play in which, or a story turned into a play or an opera in which, right, somebody descends into the netherworld. So check out the descent there. We've got stairs all the way down. We've got rhythmic spaces. We're telling the story of the place with extremely limited visual choices, right? You essentially have stairs and light and space. I mean, the stairs create the space, right? But that's it. And we're gonna portray all this epic storytelling through just that stuff. Here's one from a verse play by Ibsen. So this is not a realistic play called The Vikings of Helgeland. And like the one on the left, I just love that. Like isolated human in this pool of light in this enormous space. So I put a little Sophie Treadwell in there for you and paired her up with Appiah and Craig and some of their work, because what do Appiah and Craig have to do with Mackinac? Right? Appiah and Craig said, we need to tell epic stories about myth and legend. Treadwell said, with Mackinac, I want to tell the everyday story of one woman. So what she's doing is drawn more from Ibsen than it is from Wagner, storytelling-wise, right? But they both agree that we should apply the idea that emotional expression is more important than objective reality. And her question is, what if we took that idea and applied it to an everyday story? What if we departed from realism, but still tried to tell an everyday story, right? So one of my discussion document questions for you is, as you read Mackinac, where do you see emotional expression rather than just objective reproduction of reality used to tell this everyday story? Okay, next up, we will get into Expressionism. And I just want to close with Appiah and Craig and Expressionism. They are not Expressionists, but these ideas did develop alongside one another. So it's important to say, nope, these two guys are not Expressionists, but they have a lot of ideas in common with some of these other artists and thinkers I'm going to talk about. All right, that ends part one.